John and Joan Tilley were my 11th great-grandparents, and both were from Hinlow, Bradfordshire, England. John was born in 1571 and Joan in 1567. They had 4 children: John, Rose, Robert, and Elizabeth. Elizabeth would be their only surviving child. The others died young. They decided to leave England and make a new home in America, and John was the head of his group, the Tilley Group. They were members of the Leiden congregation from Holland. He was a separatist. They joined the Mayflower travelers with their 13-year-old daughter Elizabeth, and John's brother Edward, and his wife Agnes, also known as Anne, along with their niece Humility Cooper and nephew Henry Sampson. The Mayflower departed from Southampton on August 5th, 1620, and once from Dartmouth on August 21st, because the ship that was also sailing with the Mayflower, called the Speedwell, was leaking, and after deciding to leave the Speedwell behind, the Mayflower finally departed Plymouth on September 6, 1620. The small 100-foot ship had 102 passengers and a crew of about 30 to 40 in extremely cramped conditions. By the second month out, the ship was being buffeted by strong westerly gales, causing the ship's timbers to be badly shaken, and a man fell overboard. His name is John Howland, and he was lucky enough to get hold of a topsail halyards which hung overboard and ran out at length. Yet he held his hold till he was hauled up by the same rope to the brim of the water, and then with a boat hook and other means got back onto the ship again. With caulking failing to keep out seawater, and with passengers, even in their berths, lying in wet and ill. This, combined with a lack of proper rations and unsanitary conditions for several months, attributed to what would be fatal for many, especially the majority of women and children. On the way there were 2 deaths: a crew member and a passenger. But the worst was yet to come after arriving at their destination, when, in the space of several months, almost half the passengers perished in cold, harsh, unfamiliar New England winter. On November 11th, 1620, after about 3 months at sea, including a month of delays in England, they spotted land, which was the Cape Cod Hook, now called Provincetown Harbor. After several days of trying to get south to their planned destination of the colony of Virginia, strong winter seas forced them to return to the harbor at Cape Cod Hook. John Howland was born about 1592 in Fenstaden, Huntingdonshire, England. Mr. Howland was listed as a manservant to John Carver on the Mayflower Voyage. In November 1620, the Mayflower Compact was signed by nearly all the adult male colonists and 2 indentured servants. One of those indentured servants was John Howland. His signature on the famous document suggests he was likely an adult and at least 21 years old. Both John Tilley and his brother Edward were involved in the early exploring expeditions of the Cape Cod area in November and December of 1620, with both suffering the effects of being ill-clad and wet in freezing temperatures. One such extensive exploration in which the brothers are named as having taken part began on Wednesday, December 6th, 1620, in freezing weather, using the ship's shallop, a light, plus a shallow water boat with oars and sails, navigated by 2 pilots and crewed by a master gunner and 2 sailors. The pilgrims on board for this expedition, in addition to the Tilleys, were John Howland, Stephen Hopkins, and his servant Edward Doddy. Senior members on the expedition included John Carver, William Bradford, Militia Captain Miles Standish, and Edward Winslow. The number of persons on this exploration was less than half of a prior expedition, due to many having been ill. As was recorded, very, very cold and hard weather, in which time 2 were sick unto death. This exploration would not turn out well for the English in their first encounter with the Indians, as they found that slow-firing muskets were no match for the rapid-fire arrows. This Indian challenge to the Pilgrims was later known as the First Encounter. Sadly, my 11th great-grandparents, John and Joan Tilley, both died the first winter, as did his brother Edward and his wife Anne. The only Tilley surviving from the Mayflower was John's 13-year-old daughter Elizabeth. John Howland lived with Mr. and Mrs. John Carver and their manservant. Some have speculated that there was some type of family relationship between Howland and the Carvers, but no proof has been discovered. The first winter at Plymouth was exceptionally difficult. The colonists had landed too far north and too late to plant crops to get through the cold months. Howland and Carver, however, lived through the winter. Unfortunately, Mr. and Mrs. Carver died the following spring. Because the couple's children had passed away before the family had left Europe, it is speculated that John Howland inherited the Carver estate. When Elizabeth Tilley became orphaned, Mr. and Mrs. Carver took her in. There is a theory that Elizabeth then became a ward to John Howland, although there's no evidence that there were any formal wardships for any of the orphan children. When Elizabeth turned 16 in 1623, she and John married. It is believed that they were the 5th marriage in the new colony. They initially built a house on First Street and over time acquired 4 acres on Watson's Hill. They also purchased acreage in Duxbury and Rocky Nook, today's Kingston, Massachusetts. Some of that land is owned by the Pilgrim John Holland Society. John and Elizabeth raised 10 children. The first out of the 10 was Desire, born in about 1624. and married in 1644 to John Gorham. Desire and John Gorham are my 9th great-grandparents, and Elizabeth and John are my 10th. John Howland held several prominent positions during his lifetime. He served as a Plymouth Colony assistant, a deputy for Plymouth to the General Court. He was also in charge of the fur trading post at Kennebec and was on the Fur Trade Committee. The family eventually moved to Rocky Nook, now Kingston, and some say this is where John died in February 1687, but it is also said that he died in Plymouth in February 1687. Elizabeth is assumed to have lived with her children after John died because the home that she and John shared burnt down shortly after John's death. It is known that Elizabeth spent the last years of her life with her daughter Lydia and Lydia's husband James Brown. They lived in Swansea, Massachusetts, now East Providence, Rhode Island. And this is where Elizabeth died on December 21st, 1687. Desire Holland Gorham died in Barnstable on October 13, 1683. Desire and John had 11 children.